Hello, Johnny London here once again. Now the video I've got for you today, I've been meaning to make for over a year, well since I got the car in fact, but at the time I was busy with the boat and all the boat things and the cruising and whatnot, and I just never got round to it, and this has been on the back burner for such a long time now. It's a nice day, so I found a nice quiet car park somewhere where I've got a bit of space, and I'm going to have a chat to you, and then we'll have a look around the car. This isn't specifically about this car, this is a Saab 9.3, but the things I'm going to tell you apply generally to when you buy a second-hand car. It's just sort of what to look out for and what to avoid. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now the first thing you can do is you can look at the car online, can't you? This is the way we do things nowadays. Back in my day I'd have had to have peered through a grainy old picture, if I was lucky, about the size of a thumbnail in a magazine, one of those sort of newspaper come magazine type things, and a lot of the time if you're buying a car locally there wouldn't even be a picture. If it was in the local paper there'd be just a description. Good runner. Yeah, we've all heard that one, haven't we? So now we're very fortunate. We've got the ability to have a really good look at what we're going to go and see before we even get there. Now pictures don't always reveal everything, but if you scrutinise them and they're decent quality pictures, you can find out an awful lot, so you can save yourself a wasted trip in many instances. The other thing you can do, of course, you can speak to the owner, and the things you should be asking them are how long they've had the car, why they're selling it. That's particularly important. They should have a good reason for selling it. It should be something like, well, we've had the car for a few years now and we're upgrading to something considerably newer. They're spending like a lot more money to get something better. If it looks like they're buying something, sort of in an equivalent price range, or they've got some sort of kind of flimsy excuse like, oh, well, we're not really using it much, or we wanted something a bit bigger or something a bit smaller, have a think about that, because they could be trying to palm off their sort of unwanted rubbish on you. You'll also want to know the service history of the car, and a lot of older cars, well, that's usually gone AWOL, so if you're lucky and it has got a service history, well, that certainly counts for something. The amount of previous owners is another thing. If the car's changed hands many times, you're bound to have had someone who didn't want to maintain it. They'll have run it for 6 months, a year, 18 months maybe, with doing nothing at all to it, and then just passed it on to somebody else. And cars like that have been through many hands are often quite neglected. Now this car I've got here had 2 previous owners, so it was advertised with 1 previous owner, because when people advertise cars they always knock one off because they don't count the last owner. So when it said 1 previous owner it really meant 2, but I knew that anyway. One last thing that you can do, and this is a very, very useful thing indeed, you can actually just look up the history of the car's MOTs online now. You just go to the government website, or just put in on your search engine, car MOT checker, and as long as you've got the registration of the vehicle. Now some pictures people blur out the registration because they're worried that somebody's going to use that registration to clone another vehicle and go and do a ram raid or something like that, but most of the time if the picture's not displaying the number plate because it's been fuzzed out, you can just speak to the owner and get it, can't you? If they won't let you have the registration, then just move on to something else. So with this, for example, I looked at the registration, I could see all the old MOTs. They make quite interesting reading. You'll see things like brake pads, brake discs, coil springs, all the usual sort of sundry items that will break and wear out and be replaced regularly, and you shouldn't be concerned about that. There'll be things like track rod ends, bushes, various sort of sundry items. I mean, the roads are so potholed nowadays, we're all getting through tons of that stuff, really a lot more than we should, and suspension is more complicated than it used to be, so there's more sort of little moving around bits that get worn out. Drop links, that's one you'll definitely see. Now if you see anything a bit weird, like I don't know, corrosion under near side seal, or something like that, and then the subsequent year it's gone away, you've got to ask yourself, has that been properly repaired, or did someone just clean it up and put a load of thick old gunk over it and hope the next MOT bloke was a bit less thorough and didn't notice. So any little anomalies like that, and obviously this applies more and more as the car gets older, you know, you will get into sort of serious problems and corrosion, then, you know, that's again something very much to beware. Now, I normally like to buy my cars privately. I like to go and see the person who's selling it, and I can get a good idea of what the car's like, at least from the time that it's been in the hands of the last owner, and that makes me feel a lot happier that it's not stolen or messed around with. On this occasion, I bought this car from a dealer. This is a Saab 9.3, and I wanted an estate. There wasn't much about when I was looking, and a dealer sort of quite near to where I was had this up for sale. It seemed like a good price, and it had everything I wanted. Now, when you buy from the trade and you buy a cheap car, they haven't got much of a markup. I mean, he probably bought this off the auction for 300 quid and knocked it out to me for 12.50, you know. But really, that doesn't leave them sort of much markup to fix a lot of major problems. They're interested in getting this car off the auction. Most dealers just buy their car from, I think it's British Motor Auctions or something like that. It's a trade-only thing, so they've got a constant supply of cars that they can get very easily. They just want to throw a bucket of water over them, give them a light valet, and then just, you know, stick a grand on them and sell them, really. They did MOT this, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. Now, to get a car with a fresh MOT, obviously that's great, isn't it? You've got a year's trouble-free, fingers crossed, motoring if you're lucky, and certainly, you know, no need to worry about things failing an MOT for a while. But when someone's done the MOT recently, you don't know whether they've taken it to someone that's perhaps a bit friendly with them. And obviously, trade people know other people in the trade. These dealers probably take many cars to their local MOT garage on a regular basis. They've probably got a good rapport with them. I'm not saying anything dishonest would have gone on, but sometimes things are not black and white. Sometimes you can have a part that's got a certain amount of wear. It's not going to cause any danger, any serious issues. Ideally, you would replace it. You know, sort of grey issues like that. You can get things where somebody will be really strict and then saying, oh no, there's a little bit of movement in that bushing, I'm not letting that through, and someone else will say, well, that's all right, you know, put it as an advisory. That's the thing we have nowadays with MOTs. We have advisories. It's a very useful category because it does allow for that sort of grey area, if you like, and with old cars it is all a bit of a grey area, really. So again, if you see advisories on the MOT, you know, that's something you're going to need to do at some point, but you know, you don't usually need to worry immediately. Now, as I said, this is Saab 9.3, but what I'm going to show you applies to all cars really, and it's just going to be a general video to spot the things that you might want to spot when you're going to buy an old car. So let's hop out and have a little bit of a look around. Okay, so the first thing you do when you get to a car, you just want to have a general look around to get an overall impression. We're looking for things like wonky panels, uneven gaps between panels, anything like that. Now, here we can see a gap between panels. It's fairly substantial. It's about 7 or 8 millimeters. Now, is that correct or not? I don't know, because I don't know Saabs particularly well. But one thing you can do, you can just reference that and have a look at the same gap on the other side of the car. They should be the same. If one of them's different, then obviously something's been messed around with at some point, hasn't it? Next of all, we're going to want to have a look at the actual panels themselves. Try and get yourself at an oblique sort of angle, so you're looking right down the length of the car and catch it in the light, and that way you'll be able to see any little wibbles or wobbles or deviations in the smoothness of the panels. Now, this could be because it's been in a bit of a scrape or an accident and it's not been repaired particularly well. It doesn't necessarily mean the car's no good, but obviously it's better to buy a straight one, isn't it? This side's straight as a die, almost, and this side's good too. And hopefully, while you're checking for the straightness of the panels, you'll also keep your eye out on the colour of the car. Again, if any of the panels are a different colour, that's a sure sign that they've been repaired at some point. Now, this car's black. It's not the easiest colour to spot differences on, although in certain lights you can still see. Sometimes the black might be a little red tinged or a little brown tinged or something like that. The easiest colours to spot imperfections on are things like light metallic blue or silver. They're very easy. You can see those you know, a mile away really if anything's been messed around with. Now another important thing, apart from all the panels lining up nice and straight, is that the doors should shut well. You shouldn't have any that don't want to close or open nice and smoothly. This one's very good. No problems there. I said almost. This panel has had a little bump. This side's okay though. And while we're at it, we'll check the wheel rims. These are straight enough. And of course, the old favourite. Make sure the tyres have got some tread. There's a small chip on the windscreen here. Well, as you can see, this car is certainly far from perfect, but at the moment I'm not seeing anything that would necessarily put me off it. Well, at least not at the right price anyway. The next thing to do is to have a look under the bonnet. Now, modern cars are usually pretty tightly packed in under a bonnet. Back in my day, it was mostly all just empty space. So there's a lot of things under here, and if you're not fantastically familiar with cars, you are going to struggle. Now, one thing you can do is you should check the engine to see if it's warm. Hopefully, nobody started the car and the engine should feel nice and cold, and that way you can check to make sure that the car does in fact start from nice and cold. Now this engine runs perfectly and it starts on the button, no problem at all there. But if you listen, you might be able to hear a slight tapping noise. Now I was a little bit concerned about that at the time. It could be anything, a variety of things. But I narrowed it down to something around the ancillary belt. That's components, drive things like power steering and whatnot. I don't think it's anything too serious to worry about just yet. Of course, while you've got the engine running, just pop around the back and have a look at the exhaust. It's not much to see, and that's what you want to see, not too much at all. If it's a cold day, you might see steam. Don't confuse that for smoke. If you're getting smoke out of the exhaust at start up, that means there's wear to the engine. If you're getting smoke out of the exhaust continually, well, that means there's even more wear to the engine. In either case, probably time to walk away. Another thing you'll definitely want to do is have a look at the oil. Now ideally you would have done that before you started the engine, because now the dipstick levels are all going to be splashed about the place and it's not going to make much sense. But you can still do the most important thing of all, which is to have a look inside the oil filler cap. And this one's clearly marked. It's got a picture of an oil can on it, so you don't need to confuse it with the water or anything. And inside there, and this is something you'll see dealers doing when they're at the auction. You haven't got much time at an auction to check a car out properly, but this is a very important check. If you see a bunch of sort of cream cheese, sort of browny sludge all built up on there, then you've got a problem. That should be clean as a whistle, just sort of black oily, nothing else on there. If you've got sort of cream cheese, that means oil is mixing with the water and you've probably got a head gasket issue. Stay away. While the bonnet's up, check the front slam panel. It should be straight and its condition commensurate with the car's age. I'm trying to show the chassis legs or rails. Again, don't want any bends, breaks or bodges. Let's have a check of fluid levels. Coolant, brake fluid, power steering. A bit inaccessible though. Now, if you're feeling adventurous and you don't mind getting a little bit mucky, and maybe the ground's not too wet and horrible, you should really, if you can, try and ascertain what's going on underneath the car, certainly with an old car like this. Now cars are quite low these days, but you can, if you're really careful, peer underneath. If you see loads of rust and bits hanging down and what look to, well, the casual observer like holes, because they probably are holes, then again walk away. You can run your hand under the sills. This is an area that always goes, but of course on modern cars a lot of that's covered up with plastic, so you don't really know what's going on. Now with this car there was an issue at the front, so let's have a look at that. Now on this car there was an issue with what they call the under tray. Some cars have like a big thing of sort of plastic or kind of pressed waterproof something or other that goes under the entire engine bay and keeps all the crud from dropping out onto the road. This one doesn't quite have that. It has one that goes back about a foot, 18 inches, something like that. Just tidies up the bottom of the car. Now on this side it was completely broken and it was hanging down. I'm surprised it got through the MOT, but it did, but there you go. The problem with that, apart from you shouldn't have anything hanging off your car obviously, is that there was an electrical connector that used that as a sort of anchoring point, and that was the connector to the squirters, I think. So after I got the car I looked for a new one of these. Was fortunate enough, you can get them, £65, a lot of money for a piece of plastic, but it was an easy swap and it tidied the car up no end, plus the squirters work now. As you can see on this car there's a very nasty scratch across the bonnet, and that's certainly something that will put some people off, but on a car of this age, well, I wanted it, so I just had to live with it, didn't I? And there's a scrape here and a bit of rust here. Now there's one thing that I found that was a little bit more serious. The steering was a bit loose. There was some play in the steering wheel. Now what that means is that when you turn the steering wheel there's a little bit of a dead spot before the wheels of the road wheels turn, and that's obviously not ideal. It could be dangerous at a worst case scenario, or at very least a bit annoying. Probably the MOT should have picked that up, but it slipped through undetected by them anyway. So I told the guy that I thought it was probably the steering rack. That's a complicated and expensive part to replace, and that was a bit of a ploy on my part to try and get a bit of money off the car, get the price down a bit. I'd had a look and I'd already realised it was just a thing called the universal joint, which is a relatively simple thing to replace. It's in between the steering column that goes down into the engine bay and the steering rack that goes across, spanning from wheel to wheel, and all it is, it's an elbow thing with a pin in it, and it all just swivels and moves around as you turn the wheel. They're prone to wearing out obviously, and on these particular cars I gather that water gets onto them and causes the sort of moving part of the mechanism to rust a bit, and that's certainly what had happened. I managed to source a really good reconditioned part for £100 online, and it took me about an hour to pop out the trim there and lift up the bonnet, and you just slide the old one out and slide the new one in. There's just a bolt on each end, and it was a very easy fix, and it's made a lot of difference to the driving of the car. Now one thing I did notice after I'd had a test drive actually was, unbelievably, the brake lights on one side of the car weren't working at all. They're completely inoperative, and while I was there the guy fiddled around with it and sort of got it to work for a minute, and then it stopped working again. Obviously it worked at the MOT, but it obviously died since, and I said, well, I can't take the car like this, so I obviously have to fix that before I go on the road with it. And they did. They put a new unit on, and a couple of days later I was able to pick the car up. Of course he charged me another 50 quid for the car, but there you go. I rather like these tall rear light units. Right, well, we're nearly there. Just one more thing to cover, well, penultimate thing to cover. There's a bit of wear on these brake discs. I noticed that when I looked through the MOTs online for the car. It had been mentioned. They were worn, pitted or scored, which is typically a phrase that you'll see. And obviously what the garage has done to get it through the MOT, they've just put new brake pads on, which have you know, tightened everything up and improved the stopping power. And of course if the car passes the rolling road test, the brakes are basically performing as they should, and it's not really a safety issue, and it's passed the MOT. But at some point in the future, they're not actually that bad. You can tell there's usually what they call a bit of a lip on the edge, so the part of the disc that doesn't come into contact with a pad doesn't wear away, and by that you can judge how much wear there is on the disc. And feeling that with my finger, it's not even a millimetre. I've seen a lot worse actually, so it's not an immediate concern, but maybe at some point in the future I'll probably swap out all the discs. It's a very cheap, quick and easy job. Well, it's not been a bad day for it today. I picked a nice bright sunny day, no rain about. It's a bit on the windy side, but there you go, it is January. So I've come back into the warmth of the car just to sum up. There's one more thing, as I said, that I wanted to mention. Probably the worst thing about the car actually. When I test drove it, I noticed that the gear change wasn't particularly good. Now this is a front wheel drive car, and all the front wheel drive cars I've had have never had really what I call a very good positive gear change. The way they do it, because the engine's mounted transversely, so it's not head on with the car, it's on sideways, they have to do a remote linkage from the gearbox to the engine, so you get all these little sort of cables and pins and rubber bits and things all bending around and moving, and you can imagine as that gets a bit old and a bit worn, you lose the sort of nice crisp positive feel that you would want to have when you change gear. That I can live with, but the other thing is the clutch is a bit high, which means there's not much meat left on the clutch. It's still working fine, it doesn't slip, so you know, again, what can you do? And the clutch is also a little bit rough sometimes when you're pulling away, and I suspect that's probably a main seal oil bearing, which is something that I don't want to get involved with, but it means that where the clutch meets the engine, there's probably a little bit of engine oil leaking onto the clutch, and which causes it to be a little bit rough sometimes. So that's unfortunate, but the car goes. I've had it for over a year now, and you won't believe this, it actually sailed straight through the last MOT. So Saabs have gone up a lot in my opinion. Quite happy with the car. Had it been a sort of top of the range, better looked after one, it would have been a really good thing to have, but as it is, it's doing the job anyway. If you are thinking getting one of these, well, you could do a lot worse. And in any case, whatever you do get, if you go through my little series of checks here, well, hopefully that'll at least help you stay away from the worst of the second-hand cars. So until next time, see you soon. For all its faults, all in all, it's not a bad old car.